Hey, howdy, hey, folks. This is Mrs. Johnson. I am in a different location. I keep moving places to record. I haven't decided where I like recording yet. Anyway, um, today we are continuing the conversation about uh production pipelines, specifically for post-harvest production. Uh, because in my last video we talked a bit about post-harvest being funky and weird and the most well versed of the production pipelines. There's lots of research and things on post harvest production. So, what exactly is post harvest production? I covered this in my last video, but um, it is the stage of crop production after harvest up until the item is received by the consumer, aka the person that uses it. This includes various tasks, procedures, and infrastructure, good production practices, prevent loss, increase income, and maintain quality. That last statement is very specific to post harvest production because those are things that in post harvest production we are trying to achieve. Um, and it happens prior to post harvest too, just in drastically different ways. And this post harvest thing is important. It's very, very well versed. So we'll cover the post harvest pipeline once again. Um, uh, Again, this pipeline is a general gist of the way things work and not necessarily a end all be all, you have to do it this way, or these steps happen in this order specifically. It's more of a like written checklist of things that could happen in almost any which way, but for the most part, it happens in this general order. So first you start with harvesting, obviously, because it's post harvest. So you have to harvest based on what you're growing. You transport things, um, moving, and that could be transporting it in the field to your processing plant, could be transporting it to from processing plant to shipper to grocery store, whatever it is. So that happens a lot. Uh, and then processing, the cleaning, drying, quality control, the preparing of whatever item that you have. Uh, and that, again, mostly happens at the beginning, but can happen throughout. And then you pack things, you weigh, you label, you seal things. Um, Sometimes you sell bulk, you don't pack them. Sometimes you do because you want to sell in 5 pound bags or whatever it is. And then you store things most, I would say, throughout this whole process, but storing becomes like your end step just prior to selling things. Um, so, and that is ultimately to reduce loss, preserve quality. Um, and based on what you're growing, what you're selling, you either have a really short window to sell it or you have a really long window to sell it, or anything in between. And your last step is marketing. So, how public are your items? Who are you selling to? Um, and planning your marketing out, planning your sales out. That marketing stage often happens in the planning stages of even planting, of being like, if I plant, or if I plant 100 pounds of corn, or if I raise out 6 calves, like, do I have people to sell those things to? Um, and doing some marketing really early on in the season is helpful. But for post harvest, you start really, really marketing your product once it's ready to be sold. And that whole step, that whole line of thinking that I acquired originally came from this food pipeline. And I don't know who did this, but you can kind of see a lot of it starts with the producer in the upper left hand side, goes into pre processing, transporting, storing, processing, and packing and marketing, going to the consumers, and you can see there's holes in those in that pipe, and those are things that um, make the food pipeline not as efficient as they could be. Contamination, spillage, um, broken grain, heat, frost, um, quality, bacteria, pests, things like that. Um, those are all things that we try to mitigate and avoid in the food pipeline, in the post-harvest food pipeline, in order to get it to the people that are going to eat them. So when I'm in the business of selling you food, you actually get food, and I actually make a decent amount of money on the entire product that I wanted to sell. Um, and there are a couple of things that go into changes and different outlooks, I guess, on what that looks like exactly, for each produce. So product variety, um, specifically for produce, meat, eggs, milk, those all follow similar processes, no matter what animal they come from. Um, and your like types of final product. So, yeah, are you selling marshmallows from horse gelatin, or are you selling pig meat? Are you selling a whole pig? Um, and that second step, processing and packing. So common practices and infrastructure often change based on the size of farm and exactly what you're trying to do with that product. And last but not least, storage is super, super important when it comes to particularly produce. Produce is very finicky and has lots of options in terms of storage. It depends on what you're storing. So we'll talk about some categories and options to maintain peak quality of those. But first, product variety. Um, we'll talk about perishability. Something that is considered perishable will spoil in the best of conditions. It'll only last a couple days to 2 weeks. Milk, eggs, or not eggs, but milk. Some lettuce is a really good example of that. Something that does not stay in the fridge long. And if you leave it too long, cheese, also a good example, especially if you touch cheese a lot, sometimes it molds and is not great. Um, right. And so those are one perishable items or things in post-harvest production that you take extreme care to sell very quickly and maintain in the best of conditions. Semi-perishable probably won't spoil in good conditions, but poor conditions you'll probably spoil. And these have a big grouping of time frame. So a couple weeks to a year. So cabbage is a good example. Potatoes is a good example. Rice, depending on how you store your rice. Um, right? Rice, like loose rice, loose flour, loose sugar, not in sealed containers. Those are things that um, will last, maybe a month in the fridge, maybe a month in the original paper packaging if you're talking about rice or flour. But it's best to keep it in conditions appropriate for those things. And then non-perishable, which is our last thing. These are often really processed foods, um, or things that have, these are not raw goods that we've pulled out of the ground and are trying to sell you most of the time. These are things like tinctures, as you see in that photo. These are things like canned food. These are cans of rice, cans of flour, in heavy duty containers, that won't necessarily spoil in almost any condition, right? You can leave a can of chicken noodle soup outside for a year, and as long as it doesn't rust through that can, um, you might be okay. Some people would go, yeah, I'm not going to eat a can of soup that's been outside for almost a year. But if you're hungry, you just might eat it because it's safe enough to eat. Um, and well, the USDA has limitations on canned goods and how long canned goods can last. You'll often hear stories of how small communities will eat canned goods for years and years, even after they've been canned. So a decade later, as long as they haven't been opened and the seal hasn't been broken, they'll open cans years later and they'll be okay. There's some bacterial concerns with that, depending on what you can and how you can it, but it can happen. And our second thing in terms of product variety that we're going to consider and talk about is storability. So how long can I store these things? Which is a bit different than perishability. Perishability is how long before it is bad. Storability is how long can I make it last in the best conditions, right? So you have short term, as I said, this is often your perishable items. Greens, fruits, not apples. Apples are middle term. Um, greens, fruits, berries, um, things like that. That in the best conditions, you probably can't make them last much longer than 2 or 3 weeks. Your middle term can last in the best conditions up to 6 months. So garlic, onions, sometimes potatoes. Sometimes potatoes are long term. Sometimes, um, but cabbage, make if you pickle cabbage, if you pickle in your fridge, if you refrigerator pickle cabbage or refrigerator make refrigerator pickles, those can sometimes last up to 6 months. They're much longer than 2 weeks, um, but still not quite a year. Your long-term storability, right? And storability talks specifically about raw goods, right? So um, things that are not super, super processed, not like canned goods, but like things that I pull out of the ground and can sell in pretty much whole form. Long term is anything over 6 months. So dried grains, dried flours, um, seeds um, are often long term. Tinctures, things of those nature are often long term storability options. And I need oftentimes less protocols on storing them because they're pretty easy to store at room temperature, at in away from direct sunlight, things like that. So next we'll talk about the processing and packing of produce and what exactly that means in terms of, or what exact changes come about in our processing and our packing of post-harvest production. In processing, you're doing things for a couple of reasons. You're either doing the standard process of making it um what's the word, like approachable and safe for consumers to eat, or you're adding value to the product, and making it just a bit more processed, a bit more easier for the customer to use. It's not so raw goods, quote unquote. So standard includes washing, drying, ripening stations, quality checks, making sure that I have nice looking produce, that things like bananas and tomatoes are appropriately ripened, and having the space and room to ripen them. For onions, potatoes to a degree, garlic, I'm drying those, making sure they're completely dry before I sell them to a consumer that wants a dry product. I'm washing things like carrots, beets, lettuce. I'm washing the bugs and the dirt and the things off them. So then when I do sell them, a customer is like, oh, yes, this looks yummy and not dirty and gross. And your value added processing includes things like cooking. So restaurants they buy raw goods, they cook things, they've added value to it. And something like sauteed greens, you could buy for a couple dollars a pound at a farmer's market. but then you turn around and get it sauteed, and suddenly it's $7 to $8 a pound, uh, or even more. Sometimes you're paying, $10, $15 for of a big side of greens that have been sauteed, cooked, whatever it may be. Canning is also a good example. Cutting into small pieces, like the bite-sized pieces, or um, freezing into those like ready-made vegetable packages that you find in the freezer section. Bouquet making, we did a lot of that when I worked on some small farms. We would make bouquets, we would sell bouquets for $15, $20 a bouquet. But if you made your own bouquet, it was only $5. Um, and you could get however many flowers you want. You just had to do the work. But if we did the work, it was 15. And all you had to do was pick a bouquet. Pickling, fermenting, we talked a little bit about that. That's also a value added processing thing. So we'll jump into packing. What exactly changes in packing? Um, your quality checks happen. Your bundling and your sorting, your weighing, your labeling, your sealing. So this is really where you decide what kind of scale that you're selling to. Selling 50 tons of hay to the local market because you harvested 50 tons of hay? Or are you going to sell 50 tons of hay to feed stores? Um, those things are drastically different processes. Um, right. You're bundling and you're sorting for a direct consumer sale. You're selling less at a time of that hay. So, and you're weighing less of that hay, right? They might want 50 pounds of hay instead of 2 tons has a shipment, and you're labeling that differently. Whereas your feed store might be like, yeah, I can handle 2 tons. Send me 2 tons of hay and I'll sell it, and then I'll order more when I'm ready. And that weighing looks a lot different than the 50 pounds. That labeling looks a lot different than the 50 pounds because you have to have labeling that indicates who you are, who's selling, right? You made that hay. And so you're going to label it differently when you're not the person selling that hay to consumers. Whereas, the guy that bought 50 pounds from you of hay is going to look at you and be like, I've seen you. I knew you grow this. I knew you've grown this. I don't need a label. I know who you are. And so we'll jump into our next and last step of post-harvest production and some of the things that change, which is storage. Now, be prepared. We're going to take a second and breathe because I feel like I'm talking really fast and super discombobulatedly. Hopefully, this is at least somewhat clear. Um, Fingers crossed. Hopefully, Mrs. Johnson and the Agro Wisdom channel are doing a good job. But storage of products has lots and lots of options, particularly when it comes to produce. And if there's interest, I can talk a little bit about how we store eggs and meat and those things. But for the most part, it's fairly similar. There's just less options. So we'll jump into storage options. There are quite a few categories of things, and you might think that at first thought, when you think of storing things in your home, you might go, I store things in the freezer, I store things in the food pantry, and I store things in the cupboards and the cabinets of my house. I store things in the refrigerator. And that's where I store things. There's 4 options. But we are talking about commercial post-harvest production storage categories. So there's specifically for produce, which means that we are doing things very well to prevent loss of product and to maintain the utmost quality because it's going to take a while to get to that consumer. particularly if I'm doing large loads, like tons and tons of things. And so we'll start from left to right on the top, and then we'll go down to the bottom. Root storage is our coldest, one of our coldest settings, looks like. And root storage is cold and wet. This is probably carrots. It's been a while since I've looked at some of the numbers, but this is probably carrots. So 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, um, just above freezing, and 90 to 95 relative humidity. That's what the RH means. So really wet, really cold, really humid. Potato storage is cold and moist. And you'll see potatoes, when ideally stored, are at the top end of the temperature, bottom end of the relative humidity compared to roots. Cold and moist, 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 80 to 90% relative humidity. Squash is cucumbers, maybe, but for sure, summer squash, pumpkins, things like that. Warm and dry. Yeah, cucumbers, I think, would go in this section. Don't quote me on that though. 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit and 50 to 70 degrees relative humidity. Now you see that our temperature bumped way up. This is like, I forget what refrigerators sit at, but it's somewhere between potato storage and squash storage in terms of temperature, right? 50 to 60 is not quite room temperature, so you probably want to keep them in a cool place. Maybe not quite the refrigerator, but a cold place in your house. And 50 to 70 degrees relative humidity. So we've jumped drastically down. We do not like humidity. We get mold and things on squash related things when we store them there. Onion storage, cool and dry. Now, if you think of onions, you're thinking of anything with that papery cover on it. So onions, garlic, I'm sure there's more, but those are the two things that I can remember right now. Cool and dry, 40 to 50. So we're kind of back in between those two potato squash storage temperatures. We're cool. Little warmer than potatoes, not quite warm enough to be squash. And dry, 60 to 70% relative humidity. So the only difference between onion storage and squash storage is squash is a little warmer and has a bit more flexibility in terms of relative humidity. Sweet potato storage, as I said, roots, potatoes, sweet potatoes, those are all very similar groups of product. And once you get the hang of this, and start producing things, you'll learn a bit more about how this works exactly. And what products go where. Sweet potato storage, very cold and dry, 32 to 38. So we're back to just above freezing, and we are 60 to 70% relative humidity. So we are, you know, we are very cold, like root storage, but we're way less humid. So we're humid like onions, but cold like roots. Funny little thing. Now, brassicas. Brassicas are things like cauliflower, broccoli. These are very cold, very moist. So we're back at the 32 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing, and 80 to 90% relative humidity. So this is very similar to root storage, but the relative humidity is on the bottom end of that relative humidity. So we could, in theory, store brassicas and roots together if we planned it right? If we sat at 32, 35 degrees Fahrenheit, sat at 90% humidity, we could probably store the two together. And that's making those associations of like, what can I store together for how long? How long does it last at that storage? Is some of the things that go into post-harvest production planning, um, and transporting and storing and marketing, and where things get put in the grocery store, where things get put in the warehouse, where things get put in backstock, things like that. And so, with all that being said, that's a lot of numbers, um, lots and lots of numbers that might be a little confusing to you. So I figured we'd do some pictures of places to store food, right? We already talked about refrigerators and freezers, uh, grain silos, um, grains in silos. Think about when you look at these pictures, think about the kinds of temperatures and the kinds of humidities that there might be. I'll give you a second. Right? Grain silos, dry, hot. Pantries, room temp, not wet, not not really wet. Refrigerators, moist, cold. Freezers, extra cold. Uh, uh, right? This bottom one, drying bins, right? Very similar to food pantries, just with more airflow. So it might be a bit more drier, right? Than things stacked really, really close to one another. Canned goods, sitting outside, right? What can I store just sitting outside? Maybe not a lot. And this last photo is like a root cellar or a cold room. Those were really popular prior to refrigeration, and some farms even still have them. I've seen quite a few of small farms that use cold rooms, cooler rooms instead of refrigerators, instead of root cellars, because they were easier to build. Do I have more? But anyway, without further ado, I'll leave you to kind of ponder that question of like, where do I store food? How do I store food? How would I store food if I was selling it? How would I appropriately transport it? Things like that. And without further ado, thank you for coming. I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you for learning with me. And we will see you soon. Okay, Zoom, behave. Okay, bye. Have a great day.